In the winter of 1871, a group of German princes gathered in the dazzling Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, not to celebrate a French victory, but to crown a new German emperor. This moment symbolized the unification of dozens of fragmented German states into a single empire, an empire that, within less than half a century, would rise to industrial power, challenge the global balance, hurl itself into total war, and finally collapse in revolution. How did this empire emerge so rapidly after centuries of division? Why did it chase global influence with such intensity? And how did its ambitions shape the conflicts and ideologies that dominated the 20th century? This is the full story of the German Empire. Let us begin. For centuries before unification, what we now call Germany was not one nation but a patchwork of independent kingdoms, duchies, bishoprics, and free cities. By the early 19th century, the number of states had diminished, yet the land remained politically fragmented. At the heart of this fractured world stood a paradox: strong regional loyalties, but also a growing awareness of shared language, culture, and heritage. The roots of this division stretched back to the decline of the Holy Roman Empire. Founded in the early Middle Ages and often described as neither holy, nor Roman, nor truly an empire, it was a loose federation of territories across Central Europe. Though it claimed to inherit the Roman tradition, it was in reality a patchwork of semi-autonomous states under the theoretical authority of an emperor. Over time, real political influence passed into the hands of local rulers. By the 18th century, the Holy Roman Empire had become a symbol of political stagnation. It was complicated, outdated, and incapable of forging a unified policy or defense. Voltaire famously remarked that it was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire, capturing the sentiments of reformers who saw it as an obstacle to modern statehood. The turning point arrived during the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s. Napoleon Bonaparte's campaigns devastated Europe but also reshaped its politics. In 1806, the Holy Roman Empire was dissolved under pressure from Napoleon. In its place, he created the Confederation of the Rhine, a French client state composed of numerous German territories. Although short-lived, this confederation shattered the centuries-old imperial framework and introduced modern ideas of centralized statehood. After Napoleon's defeat in 1815, the Congress of Vienna redrew Europe's borders. Out of this came the German Confederation, a loose alliance of 39 German-speaking states. This was not a true nation, but a diplomatic arrangement meant to contain France and preserve Austrian and Prussian influence. Austria, under the Habsburg dynasty, was the dominant force, with centuries of experience managing diverse populations and acting as the traditional leader of German affairs. But Prussia, once a relatively minor kingdom on Germany's northeastern edge, was rising fast. Prussia's ascent began under Frederick the Great, who ruled in the mid-18th century. Through military victories and reforms, he transformed Prussia into a respected European power. Its efficient administration, disciplined army, and Protestant ethic became its defining traits. By the 19th century, Prussia had a reputation for strength and progress. Although still smaller and less prestigious than Austria, it increasingly challenged Austrian dominance. The rivalry between the two would define German politics throughout the century. Austria envisioned a broad, multi-ethnic empire centered on Vienna. Prussia, by contrast, envisioned a more tightly unified German-speaking nation under its leadership. Economic forces now tipped the balance further. In 1834, Prussia established the Zollverein, a customs union that excluded Austria but included most of the other German states. This created a shared economic zone, eliminated trade barriers, and stimulated commerce and industry in northern and central Germany. The Zollverein did more than boost prosperity. It tied the smaller states economically to Prussia, drawing them closer into its orbit. Austria remained politically influential, but was increasingly shut out of Germany's economic future. The groundwork was set for Prussia to take the lead. Revolutions swept Europe in 1848. Across the continent, liberals and nationalists demanded constitutions, civil liberties, and unification. In the German lands, revolutionaries called for a single Germany governed by a liberal constitution. In Frankfurt, delegates convened a national assembly known as the Frankfurt Parliament to draft one. They even offered the imperial crown to King Frederick William IV of Prussia. But he rejected it, declaring he would not accept a crown from the gutter, meaning from a popular assembly rather than from monarchs. This refusal crushed hopes of a liberal Germany. Conservative forces soon restored order, and Austria regained its influence. Yet the dream of German unity could no longer be dismissed. The next pivotal figure was Otto von Bismarck, a Prussian aristocrat and hard-nosed realist. Appointed Minister-President of Prussia in 1862, he declared that unification would not be achieved by speeches or votes, but by iron and blood. Bismarck's goal was not a liberal Germany, but a strong state under Prussian dominance. Working with King Wilhelm I, he set out to isolate Austria and secure Prussia's leadership. The first step came in 1864, when Prussia and Austria jointly went to war with Denmark over the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. The short war ended in victory, but disputes soon arose over how to administer the territories. Bismarck deliberately inflamed tensions, maneuvering Austria into conflict. By 1866, the Austro-Prussian War, also called the 7 Weeks' War, broke out. Prussia's modernized army crushed Austria at the Battle of Königgrätz. Austria was forced to withdraw entirely from German politics. Bismarck then dissolved the old German Confederation and established the North German Confederation under Prussian leadership. Austria was excluded and Prussia became the unchallenged power of northern Germany. The southern states, such as Bavaria and Württemberg, remained independent, but Prussia's influence over them grew. The unification of Germany was no longer theoretical. It was only a matter of time and of war. By the late 1860s, Bismarck recognized that unification required a conflict that would draw the southern states willingly into Prussia's orbit. France provided that opportunity. Napoleon III, ruler of France, feared the rise of a powerful unified Germany on his border. When a Hohenzollern prince, Leopold, was offered the Spanish throne in 1870, France panicked at the prospect of being encircled by Prussian dynasties. France demanded King Wilhelm I of Prussia renounce the candidacy permanently. Wilhelm politely refused. Bismarck then edited the king's report of the meeting, the famous Ems dispatch, to make it seem that Wilhelm had insulted the French ambassador. The edited message was published, enraging French opinion. Within days, France declared war on Prussia. This was exactly what Bismarck wanted. France looked like the aggressor, and the southern German states rallied to Prussia's side. The Franco-Prussian War began in July 1870. Prussia's army, well organized and supported by railroads and an efficient general staff under Helmuth von Moltke, moved swiftly. French forces were disorganized and poorly coordinated. In September 1870 at Sedan, the French army was crushed and Napoleon III captured. The Second French Empire collapsed, and a republic was declared in Paris. Yet the war did not end. The new French Republic called for resistance. Prussia advanced, besieging Paris in the autumn of 1870. The siege lasted through the winter, with starvation and hardship devastating the city's population. In January 1871, Paris surrendered, and on January 18, 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the German princes proclaimed King Wilhelm I of Prussia as Kaiser of a united German empire. The symbolism was striking. Germany crowned on French soil in the very palace of French kings. It declared that the balance of power in Europe had shifted. The new empire included 25 states, 4 kingdoms, Prussia, Bavaria, Saxony, and Württemberg, along with numerous duchies, principalities, and city-states. Prussia dominated them all. The emperor's crown belonged to the Prussian king, and real power lay in Berlin. Bismarck became the first imperial chancellor, answerable only to the emperor. The southern states, once wary of Prussian control, were now bound into the empire's military, economic, and diplomatic systems. Though they retained some local autonomy, they were firmly within Prussia's orbit. The constitution reflected Bismarck's vision, a strong central authority with limited democratic input. The war's aftermath transformed Europe. France was humiliated, forced to cede Alsace and Lorraine to Germany. This annexation, with its symbolic weight and mixed populations, planted the seeds of lasting hostility between France and Germany. The unification of Germany through iron and blood was a defining moment in European history. For the first time, a powerful, centralized industrial German state stood at the heart of the continent. This new Germany possessed vast economic resources, a disciplined military, and a confident foreign policy. The formation of the empire would fundamentally shift the balance of power in Europe and set the stage for both cooperation and confrontation in the years ahead. Bismarck had achieved his aim through a carefully orchestrated series of conflicts: the Danish War, the Austro-Prussian War, and the Franco-Prussian War. He had unified Germany under Prussian dominance. He had employed diplomacy, manipulation, and military might in equal measure. Yet even in victory, questions lingered. What would this empire become? How would it sustain stability, manage diversity, and meet the expectations of its people? These questions would define the next chapter of German history. As the empire entered its initial years, it faced the formidable task of transforming wartime unity into a lasting political order. On the 18th of January 1871, a defining moment in European history occurred within the ornate Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. Amid the aftermath of war, surrounded by German princes, military officers, and aristocrats, King Wilhelm of Prussia was formally proclaimed German Emperor, Kaiser of a newly unified German Empire. It was a symbolic act with consequences that resonated far beyond that day. Germany, long a mosaic of independent states, had now become a single nation-state under Prussian leadership. The event marked not only the end of centuries-old political fragmentation, but also the emergence of a new, assertive power on the European stage. The choice of Versailles for the ceremony was deliberate. The palace, once the seat of French royal grandeur, was selected precisely for its symbolic impact. For generations, France had seen itself as Europe's cultural and political heart. Now, in the wake of its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, it was compelled to witness the rise of a powerful German nation forged on French soil. For Bismarck and Germany's leaders, the setting was a calculated expression of victory and national unity. Wilhelm had initially been hesitant to accept the imperial crown. As a conservative monarch, he considered himself first and foremost King of Prussia, and feared diluting his authority by assuming a broader role. Yet Bismarck, ever the strategist, secured the support of the southern German states and framed the crown as a symbol of unity rather than domination. With the war concluded and national sentiment at its height, pressure from German princes and military leaders persuaded Wilhelm to accept. The proclamation was both ceremonial and deeply political. General Field Marshal Helmuth von Moltke, Bismarck, and the leaders of the German states assembled while Wilhelm stood at the center, clad in full military regalia. The Grand Duke of Baden, Wilhelm's relative, stepped forward to declare him emperor. Cheers of "Long live Kaiser Wilhelm" echoed through the hall. The new German Empire had been born not through negotiation or democratic reform, but through military victory and elite consensus. Following the ceremony, Bismarck turned swiftly to the legal framework of the empire. The constitution, finalized shortly after the proclamation, established Germany as a federal monarchy. It preserved the individual identity of the constituent states while centralizing key powers in Berlin. The empire comprised 25 states, 4 kingdoms, 6 grand duchies, 5 duchies, 7 principalities, 3 free Hanseatic cities, and the Reich's territory of Alsace-Lorraine. The emperor, or Kaiser, served as head of state and supreme commander of the military. He could appoint the Chancellor, declare war with the consent of the Bundes, and represent Germany in foreign affairs. The imperial crown was tied to the Prussian throne, ensuring that the ruler of Prussia was also Emperor of Germany. This cemented Prussia's dominance in the new political order. The Chancellor, appointed by the Kaiser, acted as head of government with real executive authority. Bismarck, as the first Chancellor, shaped the office in his own image. He answered solely to the Kaiser and not to the Parliament, known as the Reichstag. This structure allowed him to maintain strong, centralized control while appearing to function within a constitutional framework. The Reichstag, elected by universal male suffrage, served as the lower house. It could debate laws and approve budgets, but its powers were limited. The Bundes, the upper house, represented the individual states and wielded greater influence, especially in constitutional matters. Prussia held a disproportionately large number of votes in the Bundesrat, effectively giving it veto power over legislative reforms. This imbalance ensured that the conservative elites who engineered unification retained firm control. Culturally, unification sparked widespread enthusiasm across much of the German-speaking world. Nationalist sentiment had been growing for decades, and the victory over France provided a potent emotional foundation for unity. Newspapers, textbooks, and public monuments celebrated the new empire as the fulfillment of a long-held dream of national cohesion. Yet not all regions embraced unification equally. Bavaria, in particular, had been a reluctant partner and retained special privileges under the new arrangement, including control over its own army in peacetime and certain exemptions from imperial taxes. The German Empire was a federal state, but in practice it was far from equal. Prussia accounted for roughly two-thirds of the empire's territory and population, shaping nearly every aspect of imperial policy. One immediate challenge was integrating Alsace-Lorraine, annexed from France. Though many residents spoke German, cultural and political ties to France remained strong. The annexation was deeply resented in Paris and fueled French revanchism, the desire to reclaim the lost provinces. This dispute would haunt German diplomacy for decades and deepen Franco-German hostility. Domestically, unification offered both opportunity and tension. The empire inherited a strong military tradition, an expanding industrial base, and a literate population. These assets allowed Bismarck to build internal stability and project power abroad. But the state also united regions with divergent histories, religions, and political traditions. Managing these differences would be central to the government's task. Religion was a key source of division. While northern Germany was predominantly Protestant, many southern states were Catholic. The Catholic Church remained influential, often clashing with the secular ambitions of the Prussian state. These tensions erupted during the Kulturkampf, a struggle between Bismarck and the Catholic Church over education and clerical appointments. Democracy was another source of friction. While the Reichstag was elected by universal male suffrage, its authority could be overridden by the Kaiser and Chancellor. Citizens could vote, but had limited influence over national policy. The system offered the appearance of popular participation while ensuring conservative control. Despite contradictions, the early empire was marked by achievement and purpose. Germany had become a major power, unified under a strong state with a clear national identity. The empire had the tools to modernize its economy, expand militarily, and influence Europe. Yet the method of unification, military conquest, elite consensus, and centralized authority, also sowed seeds of future conflict. The political system lacked flexibility, excluded many voices, and relied heavily on the emperor's authority. The empire would have to navigate rising demands for reform, regional autonomy, and social justice. With the state established, Bismarck focused on internal structure and external strategy, managing the delicate balance between conservative control and societal change. The German Empire now existed, but would it endure? With the empire proclaimed in early 1871, Bismarck stood at the height of his power. Having unified Germany under Prussian leadership, he turned to consolidating that unity. No longer waging wars abroad, Bismarck became the architect of domestic policy in a newly created yet deeply divided nation. His goal was to preserve an imperial system that was strong, centralized, and dominated by conservative forces. Managing emerging democratic, socialist, and Catholic opposition, Bismarck held dual roles: Chancellor of the German Empire and Minister-President of Prussia. These positions gave him immense authority. He was not accountable to the Reichstag and could be removed only by the Kaiser. Yet he understood that power alone would not secure the empire. He needed to neutralize opposition, foster national identity, and prevent challenges to the status quo. One of his first domestic battles was with the Catholic Church. Though northern Germany was largely Protestant, significant Catholic populations existed in the south and west. In many areas, the Church held deep influence over schools, civil life, and communities. After unification, the Pope had declared papal infallibility, asserting the Pope could not err in doctrinal matters. Bismarck saw this as a challenge to state authority. He launched the Kulturkampf in 1871 to reduce the Church's public influence and assert state control over religious affairs. Laws placed Catholic education under state supervision, expelled Jesuits, and required priests to study in German universities. Civil marriage became mandatory, and resistant clergy faced fines, imprisonment, or exile. The Kulturkampf met fierce resistance. The Catholic Centre Party, formed in 1870, became a powerful voice in the Reichstag. Public sympathy turned against Bismarck's harsh approach, and rather than weakening the Church, the campaign strengthened political Catholic unity. By the late 1870s, Bismarck reversed course, rolling back anti-Catholic measures and reconciling with the Church. He then turned to a rising threat: socialism. Rapid industrialization in the 1870s and 80s transformed Germany. Cities expanded, factories multiplied, and the working class organized for better conditions. The Social Democratic Workers' Party, founded in 1869, gained momentum advocating labor rights, universal suffrage, and social reform. Though still small, Bismarck saw Social Democrats as a revolutionary threat. In 1878, after 2 failed assassination attempts on Kaiser Wilhelm I, Bismarck seized the moment. Although the Social Democrats were uninvolved, he used the attacks to justify the anti-socialist laws, banning meetings, newspapers, and organizations, and harassing leaders. Repression, however, did not stop the movement, which grew underground, deepening working-class frustration. Bismarck then co-opted their agenda, introducing reforms from above. Between 1883 and 1889, he implemented the world's first modern welfare programs: health insurance, accident insurance, and old age pensions. Workers gained protections funded by employers, employees, and the state. These revolutionary policies inspired welfare systems worldwide. While social reforms dulled the appeal of the Social Democrats, they did not halt the party's rise. By the late 1880s, the Social Democrats had become a significant political force, influencing public debate and labor organization. Bismarck also focused on maintaining unity through centralized control. He used nationalism to bind Germany's diverse regions into a single identity. Education reforms, patriotic festivals, monuments, and veterans groups promoted loyalty to the Kaiser and Empire. Yet regional identities remained strong. Bavaria, Saxony, and other southern states maintained distinct traditions and dialects, viewing Berlin's authority with suspicion. Bismarck's challenge was to foster national unity without provoking resistance to centralization. Bismarck also faced the delicate task of managing the empire's parliamentary institutions. Although the Reichstag was elected by universal male suffrage, its power was limited. Bismarck used it strategically, passing laws when necessary, ignoring it when convenient, and dissolving it when expedient. He distrusted political parties, viewing them as potential threats to unity. Yet paradoxically, his own policies encouraged the development of a party-based system. Alongside the Centre Party and the Social Democrats, conservative, liberal, and nationalist parties emerged to represent diverse interests. The Chancellor's relationship with the Reichstag was often tense. When it suited him, Bismarck worked with different coalitions to pass legislation, but when opposition became too strong, he relied on the Kaiser to dissolve parliament and call new elections. This pattern highlighted a central feature of the German constitutional system. Democratic representation appeared real, yet actual power rested firmly with the executive. By the late 1880s, Bismarck had dominated German politics for nearly 30 years. He had unified the nation through war, secured it through diplomacy, and stabilized it through domestic policy. Yet his authority was increasingly questioned. Kaiser Wilhelm I, who had supported Bismarck's policies, died in 1888. His son Frederick III succeeded him, but reigned for only 99 days before dying of cancer. Frederick's son Wilhelm II ascended the throne later that year. The young Kaiser was ambitious, impulsive, and determined to govern personally. He admired Bismarck's achievements but bristled at the Chancellor's dominance. Tensions between the two escalated rapidly. Bismarck's authoritarian style and unwillingness to share power clashed with Wilhelm's vision of personal rule. The conflict reached its peak in March 1890 when Wilhelm demanded greater influence over policy and cabinet appointments. Bismarck refused. After a series of disputes, Wilhelm forced him to resign. The era of the Iron Chancellor had ended. Bismarck's legacy was immense. He had built a unified German state, navigated complex domestic challenges, and preserved peace in Europe through careful diplomacy. Yet his political system was rigid, reliant on elite control, and resistant to democratic reform. With Bismarck gone, the question remained, could the empire endure without his guidance? His departure opened the door to a new era, marked by ambition, global aspiration, and dramatic shifts in domestic and foreign priorities. The man who now took the reins was not a chancellor, but the emperor himself. While Otto von Bismarck is often remembered for unifying Germany, his foreign policy achievements were equally significant. Following the wars that established the empire, Bismarck shifted from military confrontation to cautious diplomacy. His goal was not expansion but preservation. He recognized that Germany, now a dominant European power, could provoke fear and hostility from its neighbors. To prevent this, Bismarck focused on maintaining peace through a network of alliances designed to isolate France, reassure other powers, and secure the new empire. His foreign policy rested on a few principles. Germany should not seek further territorial gains in Europe. France must remain diplomatically isolated to prevent alliances that could threaten Germany. Cooperation with Austria-Hungary and Russia was essential to maintain stability in the East. Germany must avoid naval rivalry with Britain, which could trigger a conflict the empire was unprepared to face. After the Franco-Prussian War, France was humiliated, having lost Alsace-Lorraine, and viewed Germany with deep resentment. Bismarck knew France would seek revenge and likely form alliances to pursue it. To counter this, he worked to keep France diplomatically isolated and politically weak. His first major step was the formation of the League of the Three Emperors in 1873. This informal alliance linked Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Russia, the three great conservative monarchies of Central and Eastern Europe. Its purpose was to preserve the status quo and suppress revolutionary movements. Despite shared ideology, the alliance faced challenges due to conflicting interests, particularly in the Balkans, where Austria, Hungary, and Russia competed for influence. In 1879, after tensions with Russia, Bismarck signed the dual alliance with Austria-Hungary. This defensive pact stated that if either power were attacked by Russia, the other would provide support. It was not directed against France, but marked a permanent alignment with Austria-Hungary. Bismarck viewed Austria as a key partner for containing Balkan instability. To maintain ties with Russia, he expanded the alliance in 1881 into the Three Emperors League, renewing cooperation among Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia while attempting to mediate their Balkan disputes. Still, these agreements were fragile. When the League collapsed in 1887 due to renewed conflict between Austria-Hungary and Russia, Bismarck created the secret reinsurance treaty. Under this arrangement, Germany and Russia promised neutrality if either was attacked by a third power, provided Germany did not attack France and Russia did not attack Austria. This treaty exemplified Bismarck's skill at managing conflicting interests without committing to offensive war. The agreement was secret and required delicate balancing. Bismarck's aim was to prevent France and Russia from allying, which could leave Germany vulnerable to a two-front war. By maintaining ties with both Russia and Austria-Hungary, he ensured no major power could oppose Germany without risking internal instability or external conflict. Meanwhile, Bismarck maintained cordial relations with Britain. Though priorities differed, Germany focused on continental affairs, Britain on overseas empire, they had no direct territorial disputes. Bismarck avoided provoking naval competition and minimized colonial rivalry. He even supported British interests, as at the Berlin Conference of 1884–85, where European powers established rules for African colonization. Though initially uninterested in overseas expansion, Germany eventually acquired colonies in Africa and the Pacific, German East Africa, German Southwest Africa, Togo, Cameroon, and several islands. These holdings were minor compared to British or French colonies, but marked Germany's entry into global imperial competition. Bismarck approached this cautiously, seeing colonies as bargaining tools in European diplomacy rather than national priorities. His diplomatic structure became known as the Bismarckian system. It was flexible, complex, and relied on secret treaties. Bismarck prioritized practical stability over ideology, acting as a mediator among European powers to influence outcomes without provoking conflict. His approach emphasized deterrence rather than aggression. Germany maintained a powerful military but avoided offensive wars, relying on alliances and careful diplomacy to reassure neighbors. For example, when France sought closer ties with Italy, Bismarck responded by drawing Italy into the Triple Alliance in 1882, joining Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy in mutual defense, further encircling France. Yet Bismarck's system had vulnerabilities. It depended heavily on his personal judgment and ability to navigate tensions. Treaties were often contradictory, balancing opposing powers, meaning minor leadership changes or crises could unravel the structure. Secrecy also made long-term trust difficult. Domestically, Bismarck used foreign policy success to reinforce authority. European stability under his guidance legitimized the authoritarian German system. Conservative elites cited peace and prosperity as proof of its effectiveness, allowing Bismarck to focus on internal challenges like religious conflict and rising socialism. However, foreign policy left little room for democratic input. Decisions were made behind closed doors, often without consulting the Reichstag. While projecting strength abroad, Germany remained rigid politically at home. By the late 1880s, cracks appeared. Russia grew wary of Germany's closeness to Austria-Hungary. France continued to seek allies and invest in its military. Britain, though still friendly, noticed Germany's rising economic and naval power. War had been avoided, but tensions simmered. When Kaiser Wilhelm the Second ascended in 1888, he inherited an effective but fragile foreign policy system. Bismarck's resignation in 1890 removed the architect of this careful balance. Wilhelm's more aggressive, personal approach soon challenged the stability Bismarck had cultivated. Ultimately, Bismarck's foreign policy was about containment, prudence, and balance. He avoided conquest, naval rivalry, and ideological crusades. His aim was to keep Germany secure, prosperous, and respected without triggering war. For nearly 2 decades, he succeeded. With Bismarck gone, the question arose, would successors maintain the delicate architecture or dismantle it in pursuit of grander ambitions? When Kaiser Wilhelm II died in early 1888, it marked the end of an era defined by German unification and conservative governance under Bismarck. Although Wilhelm had not always agreed with Bismarck's methods, they had maintained a workable partnership for nearly 20 years. Wilhelm's son, Frederick III, succeeded him but reigned only 99 days before illness claimed him. The throne then passed to Frederick's son, Wilhelm II, a young emperor with a radically different vision for Germany's future. Just under 30 years old, Wilhelm II was energetic, ambitious, and determined to assert personal authority. Unlike his grandfather, he refused to allow his chancellor to dominate imperial policy. Believing in the divine right of kings, he saw himself not as a figurehead, but as the active leader of Germany. He famously declared, "There is only one master in the Reich, and that is I." This immediately set him against Bismarck. The Iron Chancellor had grown accustomed to running domestic and foreign affairs with minimal interference from the emperor. Bismarck viewed the Kaiser as symbolic, while he ensured stability through pragmatic control. Wilhelm, however, sought influence, attention, and independence. They clashed over social policy and handling the growing Social Democratic Party. Tensions peaked over anti-socialist legislation. Bismarck had used emergency laws for years to suppress Social Democrats, requiring periodic Reichstag renewal. As opposition grew, Bismarck proposed even stricter measures, including mandatory reporting of subversive activity by state employees. Wilhelm opposed this, fearing unrest and alienating moderate workers, while also positioning himself as a modernizing monarch appealing to labor. Another dispute involved foreign policy, particularly the secret reinsurance treaty with Russia. Wilhelm disliked secrecy and wanted Germany to act openly and confidently. He also sought closer alignment with Britain, admiring the country and holding family ties through Queen Victoria, his grandmother. Bismarck feared favoring Britain would push Russia into France's arms, undoing decades of careful diplomacy. The final rupture came in March 1890. In a dramatic meeting, Wilhelm demanded control over cabinet appointments and constitutional changes to increase his authority. Bismarck refused. Their confrontation escalated, with Wilhelm asserting his will and Bismarck warning of the risks of abandoning his policies. Within days, Bismarck was dismissed, though officially he resigned under pressure. The fall of Bismarck marked a turning point for the German Empire. For nearly 30 years, he had maintained a delicate balance of domestic stability and European diplomacy. His system was complex and often autocratic, yet it had kept Germany united and at peace. With his departure, that balance began to unravel. Wilhelm II's new approach emphasized personal rule, aiming to assert Germany's authority not just in Europe, but globally. He envisioned an empire with influence across every continent, a powerful navy to rival Britain, and a dynamic culture embracing modernity. This ambition became known as Weltpolitik, or world policy, a deliberate break from Bismarck's cautious continental diplomacy. One of the first consequences of Bismarck's absence was the failure to renew the reinsurance treaty with Russia. Without Bismarck's guidance, Wilhelm II and his new advisors allowed the agreement to lapse in 1890. Russia, feeling isolated and increasingly suspicious of Germany's growing alignment with Austria-Hungary, turned toward France. By 1894, France and Russia had signed a military alliance, precisely the scenario Bismarck had worked so hard to prevent. Domestically, Wilhelm pursued policies that emphasized his personal image and imperial prestige. He traveled widely, delivered flamboyant speeches, and portrayed himself as a forward-looking emperor aligned with the industrial age. He promoted technological progress, scientific innovation, and naval expansion. Yet while Wilhelm projected strength, his government lacked the strategic clarity that had defined the Bismarck era. The internal political structure of the empire also strained under his leadership. Without Bismarck's firm hand, conflicts among Reichstag parties intensified. The Social Democratic Party continued to gain momentum, fueled by urban poverty and growing worker dissatisfaction. The Kaiser's limited social reforms failed to stem the trend. Meanwhile, conservative elites, landowners, industrialists, and military leaders remained powerful but divided on how to respond to societal change. Some advocated stricter repression. Others urged cautious reform. The result was policy drift. Few major laws were passed, and the government increasingly relied on imperial decrees rather than legislative consensus. This lack of coherent leadership created a sense of political stagnation, even as the economy and military continued to expand. Culturally, Wilhelm II promoted a German nationalism centered on loyalty to the emperor, military pride, and civilizing missions abroad. Monuments were erected, uniforms celebrated, and imperial symbols proliferated. While this fostered a shared national identity, it also encouraged an aggressive worldview that would later shape confrontational foreign policies. Wilhelm's break with Bismarck transformed the tone of German diplomacy. Where Bismarck had operated in secrecy, building alliances and mediating conflicts, Wilhelm preferred public gestures and bold rhetoric. He gave interviews to foreign newspapers, made dramatic pronouncements about Germany's global role, and often undermined his own diplomats with off-the-cuff remarks. This unpredictability made it difficult for other European powers to gauge Germany's intentions. At the same time, Wilhelm surrounded himself with advisors less independent than Bismarck had been. Chancellors like Leo von Caprivi and Bernhard von Bülow lacked the political authority to shape policy decisively. Real power rested with the Kaiser, whose focus was often theatrical rather than strategic. As a result, German policy became reactive and uncoordinated, particularly during international crises. By the end of the 19th century, Germany had become a major industrial power, a military heavyweight, and an emerging global actor. Yet it was diplomatically isolated, politically divided, and increasingly unstable at home. The dismissal of Bismarck had removed the one figure capable of managing the empire's contradictions. In his place stood a monarch driven by ambition but uncertain how to realize it. The shift from Bismarck's realism to Wilhelm's ambition marked a new chapter, defined by risk and expansion rather than caution and balance. Germany now prepared to assert its place in the world, navigating alliances, rivalries, and crises that Bismarck had long foreseen. With Bismarck gone in the spring of 1890, the empire entered a bold new era under Wilhelm II. Germany adopted a foreign policy known as Weltpolitik, world policy, breaking sharply from Bismarck's defensive approach. Weltpolitik aimed to establish Germany as a global power, politically, militarily, and economically. It was not a formal doctrine, but a guiding principle reflecting Wilhelm's belief that Germany, as a rising industrial and military power, deserved a more prominent role on the world stage. No longer content with Bismarck's European balance and peace, the new leadership emphasized prestige, influence, and global presence. Central to Weltpolitik was building an empire rivaling Britain's in scale and stature. Although Germany had acquired colonies in Africa and the Pacific under Bismarck, they were limited in economic value and size. Wilhelm and his advisors saw colonial expansion as a means to secure raw materials, markets for German industry, and national pride. They believed that without overseas colonies, Germany would lag behind in the global hierarchy. To realize this vision, Germany invested heavily in its navy. Previously modest and focused on coastal defense, the fleet was now intended as a blue water force capable of operating across oceans and challenging British supremacy. This ambition was formalized with the appointment of Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz as State Secretary of the Imperial Naval Office in the late 1890s. Tirpitz became the architect of Germany's naval expansion, promoting the Tirpitz Plan, a long-term project to build a modern battle fleet centered on heavily armed battleships. His strategy relied on the risk theory. If Germany built a fleet capable of inflicting serious damage on Britain, the threat alone would deter attack. Even if Germany could not match Britain ship for ship, the potential for significant damage would serve as a strategic equalizer. In 1898, the Reichstag passed the first naval law authorizing new battleships and cruisers, followed by a second, more ambitious law. Over the next decade, Germany invested heavily in shipbuilding, establishing naval bases at Kiel and Wilhelmshaven, and launching warships at an accelerated pace. Britain, long dominant at sea, perceived Germany's naval buildup as a direct threat. For centuries, Britain had adhered to the two-power standard, maintaining a navy larger than the next two navies combined. Germany's challenge sparked an arms race, with both nations expanding fleets and introducing dreadnought-class battleships, the era's most advanced warships. This naval rivalry had broader diplomatic consequences. Britain, previously following splendid isolation, reconsidered its position and drew closer to France and Russia, laying the groundwork for the Triple Entente. While Weltpolitik increased Germany's global visibility, it yielded few colonial gains. Most territories were already claimed by other powers, leaving Germany with remnants such as German East Africa, German Southwest Africa, Togoland, and Cameroon. These colonies required investment and military presence but offered limited trade or strategic advantage. Still, the symbolic value of empire mattered to Wilhelm II and the nationalist press. Colonial ventures were celebrated through exhibitions, literature, and school curricula, promoting Germany as a civilizing force abroad, even as resistance was met with brutal suppression. One of the darkest episodes was the Herero and Nama genocide in German Southwest Africa in the early 1900s, where colonial forces conducted systematic extermination of resisting populations. Domestically, Weltpolitik was popular among conservatives, nationalists, and industrialists seeking overseas markets and military contracts. The naval arms race fueled shipbuilding and steel production, benefiting industrial giants like Krupp and Blohm and Voss. Patriotic groups such as the Navy League rallied public support for the fleet and justified the costs of expansion. Yet the focus on external prestige did not resolve internal tensions. The Social Democrats continued to grow, representing an urban, industrial working class. The gap between Germany's authoritarian political system and a politically aware population widened. The Kaiser's government, energetic in foreign affairs, remained resistant to meaningful democratic reform. In foreign policy, German assertiveness often backfired. Without Bismarck's subtle diplomacy, the empire became increasingly isolated. France, once cornered, aligned with Russia. Britain, threatened by Germany's navy and overseas ambitions, moved closer to both France and Russia. By the early 20th century, Germany was encircled by rival alliances. Events such as the First Moroccan Crisis in 1905 further damaged German diplomacy. Wilhelm II visited Tangier, supporting Moroccan independence, provoking France, and leading to an international conference where Germany found itself diplomatically isolated. The episode highlighted Germany's growing alienation and the failure of Weltpolitik diplomacy. Another consequence was the expansion of military planning. The General Staff, influenced by strategists like Alfred von Schlieffen, developed war plans anticipating multi-front conflict. The Schlieffen Plan, finalized in the early 20th century, envisioned a rapid strike against France through Belgium, then turning eastward to face Russia. This plan reflected Germany's increasing isolation and the perceived need to strike first in war. As diplomatic tensions grew and the naval arms race intensified, the risk of conflict rose. Under Wilhelm II, Germany had achieved recognition as a great power, but at the cost of provoking mistrust among neighbors. Its pursuit of prestige led to militarization, isolation, and a fragile European balance of power. By the eve of the First World War, Germany was a nation of contradictions, economically advanced, but politically inflexible, militarily powerful yet diplomatically encircled, culturally confident but socially divided. Weltpolitik had amplified Germany's global voice, but also accelerated rivalries that would soon ignite the most destructive conflict Europe had ever seen. As the 19th century ended and the 20th began, Germany underwent a transformation into one of the world's most advanced and dynamic economies. Beneath imperial pageantry and naval competition, industrial and scientific progress reshaped society. The empire became a modern industrial powerhouse, rivaling Britain and the United States in production, innovation, and infrastructure. Germany's industrial revolution, delayed compared to Britain and France, advanced rapidly in the second half of the 19th century. Foundations were laid during unification through the Zollverein customs union, railway expansion, and development of a skilled workforce. By the final decades of the century, industrial output surged. Coal, steel, and chemicals formed the economic backbone. The Ruhr Valley became a center of coal mining and heavy industry, with cities like Essen, Dortmund, and Bochum transforming into industrial hubs. The Krupp family, famous for cannon manufacturing, expanded into steel, locomotives, and machinery. German steel production soon surpassed Britain's. The chemical industry led global innovation, producing dyes, fertilizers, and synthetic materials. Companies like BASF, Bayer, and Hoechst became international leaders, with over 4/5 of global dyes produced in Germany by the early 1900s. Scientific research fueled industrial growth, supported by universities and technical schools producing chemists, physicists, and engineers who bridged academia and industry. This synergy became a hallmark of German development. Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch exemplified this, developing the Haber-Bosch process to synthesize ammonia for fertilizers, revolutionizing agriculture and enabling explosives production. Haber's work demonstrated Germany's dual capacity for advancing human welfare and military power. The electrical industry also excelled, with companies like Siemens and AEG leading in power generation, engineering, and communication technologies. Electric streetcars, telegraphs, and lighting systems spread throughout cities. By World War I, Germany produced more electrical equipment than any European nation. Infrastructure growth matched industrial expansion. Railways connected the empire, canals supported inland shipping, and urban centers grew as rural populations migrated for work. Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich became hubs of commerce, finance, and innovation. This transformation had profound social effects. The working class expanded and urbanization brought new challenges: overcrowding, pollution, and inadequate sanitation. Yet wages rose gradually, consumer goods became accessible, and labor unions gave workers a stronger collective voice. The emergence of a modern middle class was another consequence of industrialization. Engineers, managers, teachers, and professionals found new roles in the expanding economy. This group valued education, stability, and upward mobility, often supporting nationalist and imperial causes, seeing the empire as a source of pride and security. The business elite also gained influence. Industrialists and bankers became key players in national policy. They backed Weltpolitik, naval expansion, and colonial ventures, motivated not only by prestige, but also by the commercial opportunities these initiatives provided. The close relationship between state and industry became a defining feature of the German model. The government offered contracts, tariffs, and support, while industry delivered technological and economic power. Yet agriculture lagged behind. The eastern regions of the empire, particularly Prussia, remained dominated by large estates known as Junkergüter. Controlled by the aristocratic Junker class, these estates relied on traditional farming methods and seasonal labor from poorer areas. The Junkers retained strong political influence, particularly in the Prussian Landtag, and within the upper echelons of the military and bureaucracy. Their conservative outlook often conflicted with the demands of an industrial society, but their support was crucial to maintaining social and political order. Despite these tensions, Germany's economic growth was remarkable. By the eve of the First World War, the empire had surpassed Britain in industrial output, ranking second globally only to the United States. It led in many scientific disciplines, maintained a strong trade surplus, and accumulated significant capital reserves. The state also played a pivotal role in shaping economic development. Unlike Britain's laissez-faire model, Germany adopted an interventionist approach. The government invested in infrastructure, supported research, and protected domestic industries through tariffs. This collaboration between state, academia, and industry created a uniquely coordinated system of national development. Education reform was another pillar of this success. Primary education became nearly universal, while secondary schools prepared students for university and technical careers. Germany's university system, emphasizing rigorous scholarship and specialization, attracted students and scholars from across the world. By the early 20th century, German had become the international language of science. However, rapid change also generated anxieties. Many Germans feared traditional values were being eroded, that urban life bred instability, and that social cohesion was threatened. These concerns fueled nationalist and conservative movements that sought to preserve the essence of German identity. The idea of Volksgemeinschaft, or people's community, emerged as an ideal, a harmonious society united by shared heritage, duty, and loyalty to the nation. At the same time, workers organized more assertively. The Social Democratic Party, still under official suspicion, had become one of the largest parties in the Reichstag. Trade unions negotiated for better wages and conditions, and strikes grew more frequent. The rise of a politically conscious working class introduced new pressures into a system still dominated by elites. Culturally, the period was vibrant and complex. German literature, music, philosophy, and visual arts flourished. Thinkers such as Max Weber, composers like Richard Strauss, and artists of the Expressionist movement contributed to a rich cultural landscape. There was strong faith in progress, but also unease, a recognition that industrial power brought both prosperity and new vulnerabilities. In short, early 20th century Germany was a nation of extraordinary scientific achievement and industrial growth. It was a land of factories, laboratories, and innovation, yet also one of inequality, social tension, and political rigidity. Economic dynamism was unmatched by political flexibility. By the early 20th century, Germany stood at the forefront of industrial and scientific advancement, yet deep social and political tensions challenged the empire's foundations. Industrialization, urbanization, and educational reforms had created new demands, new voices, and new forms of political engagement. Among the most powerful forces was the rise of social democracy. The Social Democratic Party of Germany, the SPD, had its roots in the labor movements of the mid-19th century. Founded in the 1860s to represent workers and trade unions, it combined socialist ideals with calls for democratic reform. Its platform included universal suffrage, legal protections for workers, freedom of speech and assembly, and the right to organize. Though repressed under Bismarck's anti-socialist laws in the 1870s and 1880s, the SPD not only survived but gained strength after his resignation. As industrial cities grew, so did the SPD's base. Workers living in crowded tenements, laboring long hours in factories, and facing uncertain futures found in the party a voice addressing their conditions. The SPD built a political infrastructure including newspapers, cultural associations, educational programs, and unions. These organizations fostered a distinct working-class identity and community rooted in solidarity and political consciousness. By the turn of the 20th century, the SPD had become the largest party in Germany by voter support. In early 1900s Reichstag elections, it consistently won the most votes, though not the most seats due to an unequal electoral system. The Prussian three-class franchise, granting disproportionate power to the wealthy, limited SPD representation in state legislatures. Nonetheless, its growing popularity could not be ignored. The German political establishment responded with suspicion and hostility. The Kaiser, conservative elites, and the military saw the party as a threat to national unity and social order. Socialists were often depicted as unpatriotic, internationalist, and radical. Wilhelm II famously called them a gang of traitors, and socialist organizations were heavily surveilled. However, the SPD's strategy was more cautious than revolutionary. Influenced by thinkers like Edward Bernstein, the party gradually embraced reformism, focusing on gradual change through parliamentary means rather than revolution. While some factions remained radical Marxists, leadership prioritized legal participation, labor legislation, and incremental gains. This pragmatic approach helped the SPD appeal to a broader population. Teachers, clerks, and lower middle-class professionals saw the party as a vehicle for fairness and progress. As its influence expanded, the SPD became both a political force and a cultural institution. Its newspapers reached hundreds of thousands, rallies drew massive crowds, and its slogans and songs became part of daily life in working-class neighborhoods. Meanwhile, other political currents evolved. The Centre Party, representing Catholic interests, retained strong support in southern Germany and rural areas. Liberal parties struggled to define their position between a conservative monarchy and a rising socialist movement. Right-wing nationalist groups grew more vocal, combining anti-socialist rhetoric with calls for military strength, imperial expansion, and ethnic unity. These shifts produced a fragmented political landscape. Although the Reichstag was elected by universal male suffrage, real authority remained with the Kaiser and Chancellor, unaccountable to Parliament. This created a fundamental contradiction. The people could vote but could not govern. As the SPD grew, this contradiction became increasingly evident. Large segments of the population felt politically excluded despite participating in the electoral process. Frustration rose, particularly during economic fluctuations. Prosperity was often followed by downturns, with workers bearing the brunt. Strikes and labor disputes increased in frequency and intensity. Women also began organizing, demanding a voice. Though denied the vote, women played central roles in the SPD and reform movements, campaigning for suffrage, education, labor rights, and protection from exploitation. Figures like Clara Zetkin emerged as influential advocates for both socialism and women's emancipation. The state responded to unrest with a mix of reform and repression. Some social legislation improved working conditions, limited child labor, and regulated factory hours, but measures were limited and enforcement weak. Police surveillance intensified, and the army sometimes suppressed strikes. The judiciary, aligned with conservative interests, issued harsh sentences for political offenses. Simultaneously, Germany's ruling elite embraced new forms of nationalism as a counterweight to socialism. The ideal of Volksgemeinschaft, or people's community, promoted unity transcending class conflict. National holidays, military parades, and imperial imagery fostered loyalty to the state. Organizations like the Pan-German League advocated aggressive nationalism rooted in racial and cultural identity, often with anti-Semitic undertones. These efforts failed to resolve underlying tensions. Germany remained divided between an industrialized, politically conscious working class and a conservative establishment clinging to traditional authority. The imperial government resisted meaningful constitutional reform, leaving political pressure to mount. Intellectuals and reformers debated the empire's future. Some argued for gradual liberalization, fearing repression would fuel revolution. Others warned Germany faced a breaking point where social fabric could tear under contradictions. By the second decade of the 20th century, the empire stood at a crossroads. Economically strong and culturally vibrant, it remained politically brittle and socially divided. The SPD demonstrated that new forces could rise within the imperial system, but the system itself resisted adaptation. The consequences of this rigidity would soon be tested, not just domestically, but by external forces. As international crises mounted and Europe drifted toward war, the question became whether Germany could withstand the approaching storm. By the early 20th century, Germany had firmly established itself as an industrial and military power. Yet, its aggressive foreign policy strained relations with other major powers. Between the first Moroccan crisis in the early 1900s and escalating tensions in the Balkans, international incidents revealed the fragility of Europe's balance and Germany's role in destabilization. The first flashpoint was Morocco. In the early 20th century, Morocco remained one of North Africa's few uncolonized regions. France, seeking influence, had secretly aligned with Britain to assert control. Feeling sidelined, Germany challenged this arrangement. In the spring of 1905, Kaiser Wilhelm II made a dramatic visit to Tangier, publicly supporting Moroccan independence and declaring Germany's interests there. His words were a deliberate attempt to provoke a crisis and test the Franco-British alliance. The first Moroccan crisis followed. France, backed by Britain, refused to yield. Germany demanded an international conference. The Algeciras Conference convened in 1906, bringing together major European powers. Germany hoped to divide France and Britain but found the opposite. The Allies stood firm, isolating Germany. The resolution gave France a privileged role in Morocco while offering Germany only symbolic concessions. The crisis marked a turning point in European diplomacy, confirming the strengthening of the Franco-British relationship and signaling resistance to Germany's global ambitions. It also intensified German perceptions of encirclement and jealousy among rival powers. In response, Germany continued to build military strength and pursue assertive policies. Yet tensions persisted. Just a few years later, the Second Moroccan Crisis erupted. In 1911, France sent troops to quell a local uprising. Germany responded by dispatching the gunboat Panther to Agadir, claiming to protect German interests. Britain viewed the deployment as a threat to naval routes and imperial stability, bringing Europe to the brink of war. Germany ultimately backed down, accepting territorial compensation in Central Africa, while gaining little influence in Morocco. Domestically, the crisis strengthened nationalist calls for decisive action to protect Germany's status. While Morocco strained Western diplomacy, an even greater danger was unfolding in southeastern Europe. The Balkans, a region of diverse ethnicities, weak empires, and nationalist ambitions, had long been unstable. The decline of Ottoman authority, coupled with the ambitions of Austria-Hungary, Russia, and emerging Balkan states, created volatility. Austria-Hungary, Germany's closest ally, pursued its own imperial aims. In 1988, it formally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina, territories it had administered since the Congress of Berlin. This enraged Serbia, which claimed the lands as part of a greater Serbian homeland. Russia, protector of Slavic interests, protested, but ultimately withdrew after Germany firmly backed Austria-Hungary. This event, known as the Bosnian Crisis, exposed the extent of Germany's commitment to its alliance with Austria-Hungary. It also intensified tensions with Russia and Serbia. Germany's determination to resist Russian pressure convinced many across Europe that the empire was growing more assertive and willing to support its allies, regardless of the consequences. In the subsequent years, the Balkans witnessed two further conflicts, the First and Second Balkan Wars. In the first, a coalition of Balkan states, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro, defeated the Ottoman Empire and seized territory. In the second, these former allies turned against each other over the spoils. Austria, Hungary, and Russia became increasingly involved in supporting opposing sides, while Germany watched anxiously as the region edged closer to a broader confrontation. For Germany, these crises revealed both opportunity and peril. On one side, they allowed the empire to showcase loyalty to Austria-Hungary and assert influence in European affairs. On the other, they highlighted the danger of being pulled into a war by a smaller ally's actions or the volatility of nationalist movements in southeastern Europe. By this stage, Europe's alliance system had become deeply polarized. Germany and Austria-Hungary stood united in the dual alliance, while France and Russia were bound by a military treaty. Britain, increasingly wary of Germany's naval and diplomatic maneuvers, drew closer to both. Though not formally part of a triple alliance, the understanding between Britain, France, and Russia, later called the Triple Entente, was solidifying. German military planners, particularly within the General Staff, began to regard war as inevitable. Strategic thinking centered on preparing for a two-front conflict. The Schlieffen Plan, developed in the early 20th century, outlined a rapid assault on France through Belgium, aiming to defeat France quickly before turning east to face Russia. This plan demanded precise timing, rapid mobilization, and total commitment. Once enacted, it left little room for diplomatic maneuvering once a crisis erupted. Internally, Germany's leadership was divided. Civilian officials often favored restraint, diplomacy, and stability. Yet, within the military and nationalist circles, impatience with diplomatic failure was growing, accompanied by the belief that Germany must act decisively or risk decline. The early 20th century crises convinced many that confrontation was not just possible, it was necessary. At the same time, public opinion was shaped by nationalist rhetoric and a press portraying Germany as encircled by enemies and denied its rightful place in the world. Naval leagues, patriotic associations, and nationalist publications fostered the view that Germany must stand firm and prepare for conflict. A sense of destiny, mingled with grievance, spread across the empire. By summer 1914, Europe was a continent tightly bound by alliances, driven by nationalism armed with enormous militaries and led by governments often more fearful of appearing weak than of going to war. Through assertive diplomacy, unwavering support for Austria-Hungary, and meticulous military planning, Germany had positioned itself as a central player in this perilous environment. The Moroccan and Balkan crises had not sparked a general war, but they had reshaped Europe's political and psychological landscape. They had tested alliances, inflamed rivalries, and narrowed the space for diplomacy. The next crisis would not be diffused. The spark would come not from Berlin, Paris, or London, but from Sarajevo, delivered by a young assassin whose actions would ignite the world. On a quiet Sunday morning in late June 1914, a gunshot rang out in Sarajevo that would echo across continents. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, marked the moment when years of diplomatic tension, nationalist rivalry, and military preparation converged into irreversible conflict. While the act was carried out by a Bosnian Serb nationalist, the chain of decisions that followed, particularly in Berlin, transformed a regional crisis into a global war. Central to those decisions was what came to be known as Germany's blank check. Franz Ferdinand had travelled to Sarajevo to observe military exercises and assert imperial presence in Bosnia-Herzegovina, a region annexed by Austria-Hungary years earlier. His assassination, carried out by Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old member of the nationalist group Young Bosnia, aimed to strike at imperial domination and support Serbian unity. While shocking, political assassinations were not unprecedented in Europe. What set this one apart was the reaction it provoked and Germany's role in encouraging that response. In Vienna, Austro-Hungarian leaders saw the assassination not only as a personal tragedy, but as a direct challenge to imperial authority. The empire had been grappling with internal ethnic tensions and growing Serbian influence in the Balkans. Many in government and military circles believed decisive action against Serbia was necessary, suspecting its involvement in the assassination. Austria-Hungary, however, could not act alone. Military action against Serbia risked provoking Russia, which positioned itself as the protector of Slavic nations. Vienna turned to its closest ally, Germany, seeking assurance that it would stand by them if the conflict expanded beyond the Balkans. Germany responded with unambiguous support. In early July, just days after the assassination, the German ambassador in Vienna conveyed Berlin's message. Germany would support Austria-Hungary regardless of the course of action it chose. This unconditional backing became known as the blank check. Why did Germany offer such unqualified support? Several factors influenced this decision. German leaders, particularly the military and foreign policy elite, believed a confrontation with Russia and its allies was increasingly likely. They saw Serbia as a Russian proxy and a Balkan clash as inevitable and strategically necessary. Additionally, there was a sense that time was not on Germany's side. Russia's military was growing stronger, and some German generals believed a war now would be more winnable than in later years. Kaiser Wilhelm II played a complex role. Initially supporting Austria's hardline stance, he later appeared hesitant, suggesting Serbia's compliance might prevent war. However, by that point, German officials, notably Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, and key military leaders had already committed to fully backing Austria. With German support secured, Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia on July 23. The demands were intentionally severe, including suppression of nationalist propaganda, dissolution of nationalist groups, and allowing Austro-Hungarian officials to participate in investigations in Serbia. Although Serbia accepted most terms, it rejected those infringing on its sovereignty. Vienna deemed the response unsatisfactory and declared war on Serbia on July 28. Russia, bound as Serbia's protector and wary of Austro-Hungarian ambitions, began mobilizing its forces. Germany, seeing Russian mobilization as a direct threat, declared war on Russia on August 1. 2 days later, Germany declared war on France, allied with Russia through a military treaty. To implement its strategy, Germany invoked the Schlieffen Plan, calling for a rapid strike through neutral Belgium to encircle and defeat France before turning east to face Russia. The invasion of Belgium on August 4th prompted Britain to enter the war. Though not formally allied with France or Russia, Britain had long guaranteed Belgian neutrality. The violation offered both legal pretext and moral justification for war against Germany. Within weeks, a regional dispute between Austria-Hungary and Serbia escalated into a general European war. At the center of this escalation stood Germany, its leaders convinced that national survival and prestige depended on swift, decisive action. The decision-making in Berlin during this period remains one of the most scrutinized episodes in modern history. While Germany did not plan the assassination and may not have desired a general European war at that moment, its leaders took calculated risks. They gave Austria-Hungary a green light to act aggressively, failed to restrain an ally when restraint was possible, and committed to a war strategy demanding immediate mobilization. By issuing the blank check, Germany aimed to preserve its alliances, maintain credibility, and gain a strategic advantage. It underestimated, however, the magnitude of the reaction and the resilience of opposing coalitions. The German public largely rallied behind the government as war broke out. Nationalist fervor swept cities, crowds cheered departing soldiers, and newspapers hailed a righteous struggle. Many expected the conflict to be brief, lasting weeks or months. The government, too, anticipated swift victory, confident in its military planning and the strength of its army. Yet beneath the optimism lay harsh realities. The war Germany helped ignite was not a limited European conflict, but involved the world's largest empires, modern weaponry, and mass armies. It would be decided not by diplomacy or swift campaigns, but through attrition, sacrifice, and endurance. Germany's role in the July crisis was not that of an innocent bystander. It was an active participant, motivated by strategy, alliance obligations, and fear of encirclement. The blank check was both a diplomatic error and a reflection of structural pressures within the empire. As German troops entered Belgium and France and Russian forces advanced in the east, the stage was set for a war unlike any before. Germany, confident and resolute, was fully committed. The cost of that commitment would soon be measured in blood, hardship, and the empire's very survival. By early August 1914, Germany stood on the brink of a war that would engulf not just Europe, but much of the world. The calculated assurances of July had turned into irreversible action. Mobilization orders were issued, railway timetables activated, and soldiers dispatched to frontiers. The great powers, bound by alliances and strategic doctrines, shifted from diplomacy to military engagement. Germany, confident in its preparations and driven by the belief that speed would secure victory, set its vast war machine in motion. The German war strategy, developed by General Count Alfred von Schlieffen and refined by successors, anticipated a two-front conflict against France in the west and Russia in the east. It relied on defeating France quickly, ideally within weeks before Russia could mobilize fully. The plan assumed that speed, decisiveness, and overwhelming force would ensure victory. To achieve this, German forces bypassed France's fortified eastern border by invading Belgium and Luxembourg, sweeping westward toward Paris. Once France fell, German troops would redeploy to the eastern front against Russia. It was a bold strategy, dependent on precise timing, logistical mastery, and the assumption that Britain would remain neutral or delay entry. On August 4th, German troops crossed into Belgium. The invasion violated treaties guaranteeing Belgian neutrality, notably the Treaty of London, to which Britain was a guarantor. Germany downplayed the breach, dismissing the treaty as a mere scrap of paper, a phrase attributed to Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg. To Britain, the violation was both a moral and strategic affront. That same day, Britain declared war on Germany. Germany now faced a multi-front war against France, Russia, and Britain, each with vast resources and global reach. What began as a Balkan crisis had become a European war, with Germany at its center. The early war stages combined efficiency with tragic miscalculation. German forces advanced rapidly through Belgium, encountering stiff resistance in cities such as Liège and Namur. Despite discipline and supply, the army met fierce opposition from Belgian troops and civilians. In towns like Leuven and Dinant, German troops committed atrocities, burning buildings, executing civilians, and destroying cultural landmarks. These acts, widely reported, fueled Germany's reputation as an aggressor. The invasion, intended as a tactical shortcut, provoked global condemnation and cemented Britain's entry into the war. Despite these setbacks, Germany's advance continued. By early September, German forces neared Paris. The French army, recovering from earlier losses, retreated across the Marne River. For a moment, it seemed the Schlieffen Plan might succeed, with France falling quickly. Yet the plan overestimated the right flank's speed and endurance. Extended supply lines, exhaustion, and logistical errors took their toll. Crucially, the French army under General Joseph Joffre regrouped and counterattacked at the First Battle of the Marne. Reinforced by British troops from across the Channel, the Allies halted the German advance. A gap opened between German units and the offensive lost momentum. The High Command, recognizing the danger of overextension, ordered a retreat to defensible positions. The attempt to defeat France in a rapid campaign had failed. The war would not end in weeks, but become a protracted, grinding conflict. In the east, the situation unfolded differently. Russia mobilized faster than expected, invading East Prussia. German commanders Erich Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg responded swiftly at the Battle of Tannenberg in late August. The Russian Second Army was encircled and destroyed, tens of thousands captured. It was a stunning victory that boosted German morale and elevated Hindenburg to national hero status. Yet, the Eastern Front remained active, costly, and demanding, diverting resources from the West. On both fronts, the war quickly exceeded the assumptions underlying initial strategies. The German army, designed for short campaigns, now faced entrenched resistance. In the West, a race to the sea ensued as both sides tried to outflank one another. The maneuvering ended in stalemate, with German and Allied forces entrenched from the Swiss border to the North Sea. Trench warfare introduced a horrifying new dimension to the conflict. Conditions were appalling. Mud, rats, disease, and constant shelling became the daily reality for soldiers. Artillery barrages devastated the terrain, while barbed wire, machine guns, and poison gas made advances both deadly and fleeting. The Western Front became a static battlefield of attrition, where gains were measured in meters and paid for with thousands of lives. For Germany, the failure of the Schlieffen Plan marked a turning point. The dream of a rapid, decisive victory had vanished. The empire now faced a prolonged war requiring total mobilization of society and the economy. The German government introduced rationing, redirected industrial production toward armaments, and imposed strict censorship. Civil liberties were curtailed in the name of national security. At the same time, leadership sought to maintain morale through propaganda and patriotic appeals. The war was depicted as a defensive struggle against encirclement, a fight to preserve German culture and honor. Despite rising casualties, many Germans continued to believe in the righteousness of their cause, at least during the early years of the conflict. The war also strained Germany's alliances. Austria-Hungary, though supported by Germany, struggled against Russian and Serbian forces. Encouraged by German diplomats and military advisors, the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers in late October, expanding the war and introducing new fronts in the Middle East and the Caucasus. Germany's naval strategy also evolved. Recognizing that its fleet could not match Britain's Royal Navy in a direct confrontation, Germany turned to submarine warfare. U-boats targeted Allied shipping, aiming to cut off supplies and weaken Britain's war effort. This tactic would have profound consequences later, particularly regarding neutral nations. By the end of 1914, it was clear the war would not end by Christmas as many had hoped. Germany was now embroiled in a massive multi-front conflict with no end in sight. The human cost was already immense. The social and economic structures of the empire were under severe strain. Yet the leadership remained committed to victory, confident that German discipline, strength, and industrial capacity could still secure triumph. What had begun as a rapid military gamble had become a war of endurance. Germany, having launched its armies with confidence, now faced a far more uncertain struggle, one that would test not just its military, but the very fabric of the empire itself. By the close of 1914, Germany had failed to achieve a swift victory on the Western Front. The Schlieffen Plan had collapsed, and the war, expected to last weeks, had entered a grueling new phase. Both Germany and the Allies settled into defensive positions that would define the Western Front for the next 4 years. What followed was stagnation rather than movement, a war defined by endurance, trenches, artillery, and relentless suffering. The German retreat after the Battle of the Marne ended open maneuver and began entrenchment. As German forces dug in to defend their positions, the Allies mirrored them. From Belgium's North Sea coast to the Swiss border, a continuous line of defensive trenches stretched across Western Europe. Neither side would decisively break this line for the remainder of the war. The trench systems were complex and evolving. Initially simple ditches for cover, they gradually became elaborate structures. German trenches, in particular, were often more robust than those of their enemies. Reinforced dugouts, underground bunkers, communication lines, and firing positions were constructed to hold ground indefinitely. Behind the front lines, Germany built multiple layers of defense, including support trenches and reserve positions. Life in the trenches was harsh and punishing. Soldiers endured mud, vermin, and constant threats. Winter turned the ground into thick, clinging sludge that filled boots, soaked clothing, and collapsed dugouts. Hygiene was minimal. Lice were endemic, and diseases such as trench foot and dysentery spread rapidly. Food was limited and monotonous. Mail from home and brief moments of calm became rare comforts. German soldiers adapted as best they could. Many developed routines to cope with snipers, shellfire, and surprise raids. They built shelters from salvaged materials, created trench art to pass time, and maintained discipline through drill and camaraderie. Letters and diaries reveal a range of emotions: duty, fear, hope, despair, all set against a war increasingly devoid of meaning. Strategy became one of attrition, aiming to wear down the enemy through sustained losses. Battles were launched with limited territorial objectives but immense human cost. The Battle of Verdun in 1916 exemplified this. Launched by Germany to bleed France white, it aimed to force the French into a costly defense of a symbolic position. For nearly a year, German and French forces clashed around Verdun's fortresses. The Germans employed massive artillery bombardments, including gas shells, followed by waves of infantry assaults. The French countered with equally intense attacks. Hundreds of thousands were killed, wounded, or captured. Verdun yielded no decisive breakthrough but left an enduring mark on those who fought. For Germany, it consumed vast resources and manpower, ultimately forcing withdrawal to original lines. That same year, the Allies launched the Battle of the Somme. This Anglo-French offensive, partly intended to relieve pressure on Verdun, became one of the bloodiest battles in history. On the first day alone, British forces suffered tens of thousands of casualties. German defenders, entrenched and well-supplied, also endured enormous losses. The German army showed tactical flexibility, shifting reserves and reinforcing positions quickly. Yet relentless shelling and assaults exhausted even the most experienced troops. These battles illustrate trench warfare's central problem. Massive offensives often resulted in minimal territorial gains. Technology had outpaced traditional tactics. Artillery and machine guns dominated, while communication and mobility lagged. Attacks required weeks of planning and vast ammunition, yet rarely shifted front lines significantly. To adapt, German commanders explored new tactics. Later, they developed infiltration methods using small units of stormtroopers to penetrate enemy lines, bypass strong points, and disrupt rear areas. These methods influenced modern combined arms warfare, but during the trench years, their impact was limited by scale and exhaustion. The air war also emerged. Initially used for reconnaissance, aircraft evolved into tools of observation and combat. German pilots like Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, became legendary, celebrated by a public eager for heroes. Yet even in the skies, the war was one of attrition. Planes were fragile, engines unreliable, and survival rates low. Behind the lines, Germany mobilized society for war. Industry prioritized munitions and military equipment. The Hindenburg Program, introduced in 1916, aimed to double armaments production via state planning and labor conscription. Civilian goods became scarce, and food shortages took a serious toll. The British naval blockade restricted grain and essentials, causing malnutrition and unrest. Morale at the front and home deteriorated. Early enthusiasm had been widespread, but prolonged trench warfare made the realities impossible to ignore. News of mass casualties, economic hardship, and unclear victory fueled public discontent. Protests and strikes emerged. Social consequences were significant. The authority of the Kaiser and elites faced growing scrutiny. The Social Democratic Party, initially supporting war credits, began to fracture. More radical voices gained traction, advocating peace, democratic reform, and worker control. Soldiers on leave returned with grim accounts, further eroding the government's image. Within the army, discipline remained strict, but psychological strain was immense. Shell shock, now recognized as PTSD, affected thousands. Letters expressed longing for peace and alienation from military leadership. Nevertheless, most soldiers continued fighting, bound by duty, habit, and fear of punishment. Germany's high command, led by General Paul von Hindenburg and Deputy Erich Ludendorff, remained convinced of possible victory through military means. They sought decisive breakthroughs on the Western Front or elsewhere. Yet the longer the war persisted, the more detached this belief seemed from reality. The empire bled slowly, steadily, and seemingly without end. The trenches symbolized more than military stalemate. They reflected a paralyzed political system, a society stretched to its limits, and a generation trapped in an inescapable conflict. For Germany, the trenches were both battlefield and prison, where dreams of glory yielded to mud, blood, and grim determination to survive. While the Western Front defined much of the struggle, World War I was fought across oceans and continents. For Germany, the war at sea and in its colonies extended global ambitions and tested military reach. These theaters, often overlooked, shaped strategy, relations with other powers, and eventual downfall. Germany's navy, dramatically expanded before the war, sought to challenge Britain's Royal Navy and assert world power status. By summer 1914, however, the German navy remained smaller and less experienced than Britain's. Early in the conflict, the surface fleet based at North Sea ports like Wilhelmshaven and Kiel adopted a cautious stance. The Royal Navy had blockaded the North Sea, cutting Germany's trade. Avoiding direct confrontation, the fleet largely stayed in port, preserving strength for a decisive future battle. The British Grand Fleet maintained constant presence, tightening the economic stranglehold. While surface action was limited, German naval forces were active elsewhere. In November 1914, at the Battle of Coronel in the South Atlantic, a German squadron under Admiral Maximilian von Spee surprised and defeated a British force off Chile, sinking 2 cruisers. It was a rare German sea victory and a morale boost. Yet a month later, at the Battle of the Falkland Islands, a reinforced British fleet destroyed von Spee's squadron. The loss of ships and crews ended Germany's serious surface operations outside Europe. With the surface fleet contained, Germany increasingly relied on submarine warfare. U-boats, undersea craft, became a stealthy and formidable threat, striking merchant and military ships. Their goal was to disrupt British supply lines and weaken the Allied war effort by cutting off food, weapons, and raw materials. In early war years, German submarines scored notable successes, sinking merchant vessels and exerting psychological impact on shipping and coastal populations. However, submarine warfare carried diplomatic risks, particularly when neutral ships were attacked. In May 1915, the British liner Lusitania was sunk off Ireland by a German U-boat. Nearly 200 lives were lost, including over 100 Americans. The sinking sparked international outrage, especially in the United States. Although carrying war materials, civilian deaths created intense diplomatic pressure for Germany to limit submarine attacks. For a time, the German government agreed to suspend unrestricted submarine warfare, fearing that American entry into the war might tip the balance against the Central Powers. Still, the strategic value of submarines remained undeniable. By 1917, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, confident that it could force Britain to surrender before American intervention became decisive. This decision had profound consequences, directly contributing to the United States declaring war on Germany in April of that year. Beyond Europe and the seas, Germany's overseas colonies became battlefields as well. Although modest compared to Britain or France, these colonies were significant symbols of national prestige and global influence. They included German East Africa, present-day Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi; German Southwest Africa, modern Namibia; Togoland, Cameroon, and various islands in the Pacific and China. At the war's outbreak, most of these colonies were quickly overrun by Allied forces. In Africa, British, French, Belgian, and South African troops launched coordinated invasions. Togoland, with its strategic wireless station at Kamina, fell within weeks. German Southwest Africa was invaded by troops from the Union of South Africa, a British dominion, and despite initial resistance, German forces surrendered by mid-1915. Cameroon proved more challenging. German troops, supported by local African forces and using difficult terrain to their advantage, resisted Allied advances for over a year. By early 1916, however, they too were forced to surrender after a prolonged campaign. The most remarkable colonial defense occurred in German East Africa. Under General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, a career officer known for discipline and unconventional tactics, Lettow-Vorbeck waged a guerrilla campaign against superior Allied forces. He relied on mobility, local knowledge, and the support of indigenous Askaris to sustain operations long after Germany lost control of other colonies. Remarkably, he remained undefeated in the field and only surrendered in November 1918 after learning of the armistice in Europe. In the Pacific, Japan, Britain's ally, quickly seized German holdings in China, including Qingdao, and occupied several German-controlled islands. Australian and New Zealand forces captured German Samoa and other territories. The fall of these colonies ended Germany's brief presence in East Asia and the Pacific. Economically, the loss of colonies had limited impact, as these territories were not yet fully integrated into the imperial economy. However, the psychological and symbolic blow was severe. The colonies had symbolized Germany's global power. Their loss signaled a retreat from that vision and weakened the narrative of imperial prestige that underpinned Weltpolitik. Moreover, the war at sea and in the colonies demonstrated the conflict's global scale. German civilians, long accustomed to viewing war as distant or contained, now experienced the full reach of total war. The British naval blockade, tightened year after year, brought hunger and deprivation to the home front. Imports of food, fertilizers, and raw materials fell sharply, and the population suffered from malnutrition and disease. In response, the German government attempted to organize domestic production and ration supplies. Substitute goods, known as ersatz products, became common. Bread made from potato flour, coffee from roasted barley, and synthetic rubber replaced scarce materials. Yet these measures could not fully offset the blockade's impact or the strain of prolonged war. The naval war and colonial campaigns revealed the limits of Germany's global reach. Despite technological innovation and bold tactics, the empire lacked the resources, alliances, and strategic depth to challenge Britain's maritime supremacy or maintain a global empire against overwhelming opposition. Still, Germany achieved lasting innovations. Submarine tactics would influence naval strategy for decades, while colonial resistance, particularly in German East Africa, highlighted often overlooked dimensions of war beyond Europe. While the Western Front stagnated in mud and blood, the Eastern Front offered a very different kind of conflict, marked by vast distances, sweeping offensives, and rapidly shifting lines. For Germany, the war in the East brought dramatic military victories and one of the conflict's most consequential political developments, the collapse of the Russian Empire and the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. From the war's earliest months, Germany faced the dual challenge of holding the West while pushing back Russian advances in the East. Although the Russian army mobilized faster than expected, it lacked modern equipment, efficient logistics and unified command. German forces under General Paul von Hindenburg and his deputy Erich Ludendorff responded swiftly. In the summer of 1914, they achieved a stunning victory at the Battle of Tannenberg, encircling and destroying a Russian army in East Prussia. This early success set the tone for Germany's Eastern campaign. Unlike the Western Front, where fortified lines limited movement, the Eastern Front allowed greater maneuverability. Germany and Austria-Hungary launched coordinated offensives aimed at pushing Russian forces out of Poland, Galicia, and the Baltic territories. By 1915, the Central Powers had recaptured large swathes of land. German armies advanced deep into Russian territory, capturing cities like Warsaw and Vilnius. They established military administrations in occupied regions, including parts of modern Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Belarus. German planners even considered long-term colonization and Germanization, revealing imperial ambitions behind military operations. Yet the Eastern War remained difficult. The scale of the conflict was immense. The front stretched from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Carpathian Mountains in the south. Roads and railways were few and weather conditions were extreme. Supplying troops across such a vast theatre posed serious challenges. Still, the German army proved adaptable, using rail transport to shift forces quickly and coordinating with Austria-Hungarian units despite frustrations with their allies' weak performance. German commanders often had to stabilize Austro-Hungarian lines or take over entire sectors. As the war dragged on, internal pressures fractured Russia. The Tsarist government, weakened by political stagnation and social inequality, struggled to maintain order. Military defeats, economic collapse, and widespread hunger eroded public confidence. Strikes, protests, and army mutinies multiplied. By early 1917, the crisis reached a breaking point. In March 1917, following mass protests and a general uprising in Petrograd, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated. A provisional government of liberal and moderate socialist leaders took power, pledging to continue the war. However, it lacked legitimacy and failed to address core social and economic grievances. Later that year, in November, the Bolsheviks under Vladimir Lenin seized power in a second radical revolution. The new regime immediately declared its intention to end Russia's war participation. Lenin, returning to Russia earlier with German assistance, saw peace as essential to consolidating Bolshevik control. His slogan, "Peace, Land, and Bread," resonated with a population desperate for relief. Negotiations between Germany and Soviet Russia began in Brest-Litovsk in December 1917. The talks revealed a profound divide. Germany, militarily dominant, demanded substantial territorial concessions. The Bolsheviks, eager for peace, sought to delay or minimize losses. Initially, they stalled, adopting a no war, no peace strategy, hoping revolutionary uprisings elsewhere would shift the balance. By February 1918, Germany resumed its offensive, advancing swiftly into undefended Russian territory. Faced with the collapsing Russian front, the Bolsheviks relented. On March 3, 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed. It was humiliating for Soviet Russia, which ceded vast territories including Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, and parts of the Caucasus. These areas contained rich agricultural lands, key industrial centers, and millions of people. The treaty effectively removed Russia from the war, allowing Germany to refocus on the West. For Germany, Brest-Litovsk seemed a monumental victory. Not only had it eliminated a major enemy, but it also provided access to vital resources. Ukraine, in particular, was seen as a potential breadbasket for the war-starved German population. German forces moved quickly to occupy and administer these new territories, yet governance proved difficult. Local resistance, political instability, and logistical problems plagued German efforts. Puppet governments were established, and officials oversaw resource extraction, but control remained tenuous. The countryside was rife with banditry, rebellion, and famine. Ukrainian nationalists, Bolshevik partisans, and other factions contested German authority at every turn. The treaty also deepened tensions within Germany. Conservatives and nationalists hailed the gains, while socialists and moderates criticized the harsh terms imposed on Russia. Some feared Germany's eastern overreach would provoke further resistance and moral backlash. Internationally, the treaty alarmed remaining Allied powers. Britain, France, and the United States saw it as evidence of German aggression and expansionism. It reinforced the perception that Germany sought not just victory, but hegemony in Europe. This hardened Allied resolve and justified continued fighting, even as German leaders hoped Russia's collapse might allow a negotiated peace in the West. In truth, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was a Pyrrhic victory. Though it removed a major enemy and provided short-term advantages, it did not end the war. The United States had entered months earlier, bringing fresh troops and resources to the exhausted Western Front. German hopes of winning before American forces arrived at full strength would soon be tested in the spring 1918 offensives. The Eastern Front, once seen as an opportunity for expansion, became a cautionary tale of overreach. Germany's ambitions to reshape Eastern Europe exceeded its governance capacity, and harsh policies alienated local populations. Still, the war in the East reshaped the geopolitical map. The Russian Empire had collapsed, replaced by a revolutionary state that would pose an even greater challenge to Germany and Europe. For now, Germany turned westward, hoping battlefield victory remained within reach. As German forces dug deeper into multi-front warfare, another battle raged at home: hunger, exhaustion, and growing discontent. By 1916, the German home front was undergoing a transformation as severe as any battlefield development. Total war demanded total mobilization, and the strain was visible in every aspect of daily life. At war's start, many Germans believed the conflict would be short. Patriotic parades, waving flags, and enthusiastic crowds sent soldiers off. But as months turned into years, and victory remained elusive, reality of prolonged warfare set in. Germany's economy, food supply, and social stability were deeply affected by industrial-scale war. One of the greatest hardships stemmed from the British naval blockade, increasingly enforced to cut Germany off from global trade, including food, raw materials, and fertilizers. The strategy aimed not to defeat Germany militarily, but to break its internal capacity to sustain the war. Germany had relied heavily on imports, particularly for food and chemical fertilizers critical for agriculture. As the blockade tightened, imports fell sharply and domestic production struggled to compensate. Fields were underutilized due to men drafted into the army. Horses essential for plowing were requisitioned by the military. Fertilizers diverted for explosives became scarce. Agricultural output steadily declined. To manage the crisis, Germany established the War Food Office, tasked with controlling distribution and rationing supplies. Food stamps and quotas were implemented. Initially promising, the system was undermined by bureaucratic inefficiency, regional disparities, and black market activity. Urban households relied on thin rations of bread, margarine, and ersatz coffee from roasted acorns. The infamous winter of 1916-1917, later called the Turnip Winter, brought severe suffering. A poor harvest, disrupted transport, and harsh weather caused acute food shortages. Potatoes, the German staple, rotted or failed to grow. Turnips, normally for livestock, were substituted for nearly everything: breads, soups, even desserts. The turnip winter became synonymous with misery. Malnutrition spread rapidly, especially among children and the elderly. Public health deteriorated. Tuberculosis, rickets, and influenza surged in crowded cities. Mothers waited hours in long lines, sometimes receiving only meager portions. Food riots erupted in several towns. Civilian morale, already strained, began to collapse. Despite shortages, the German state continued demanding total commitment from its people. The Hindenburg Program, introduced in autumn 1916, aimed to double war production by mobilizing all available labor and resources. Named after Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, the program placed enormous pressure on both industry and workers. Laborers were drafted into armaments factories. Women took on jobs previously closed to them, while prisoners of war were forced into labor. Industrial output in steel, coal, and armaments increased, but at a tremendous cost. Working conditions were harsh, hours were long, and wages lagged far behind rampant inflation. Strikes, once rare in wartime, grew more frequent. In Berlin, Hamburg, and the Ruhr, workers protested food shortages, poor pay, and lack of political representation. Although most strikes were contained, they revealed growing cracks in the wartime consensus. Frustrations extended beyond factory floors. Political tensions intensified. The Social Democratic Party, initially supporting war credits, now found itself divided. A radical faction broke away to form the Independent Social Democratic Party, calling for immediate peace and democratic reforms. Anti-war sentiment, long suppressed, surfaced in speeches, pamphlets, and underground newspapers among the middle classes as well. Anxiety grew. The war had depleted savings and disrupted careers. Professionals and small business owners struggled to maintain pre-war standards of living. The illusion of class unity promoted in the war's early stages was crumbling. The promise that sacrifice would yield victory seemed increasingly remote. Women, who bore much of the home front burden, became increasingly visible in public life. They worked in munitions factories, served as nurses, and managed households amid scarcity. Though essential, their voices were largely excluded from political decision-making. Still, women's wartime labor laid the groundwork for post-war demands for suffrage and equality. Youth were affected too. With fathers at the front and schools disrupted, many grew up in a world defined by absence and austerity. Stories of hunger, air raids, and lost brothers became daily life. The romanticism of war, prominent in early patriotic education, was replaced by sobering awareness of its costs. Religious and charitable organizations tried to ease suffering. Soup kitchens, relief funds, and communal gardens were organized in many cities, but these efforts could not offset systemic shortages and administrative inefficiencies. Trust in institutions declined, and rumors of hoarding and corruption spread widely. German leadership, particularly military command under Hindenburg and Ludendorff, remained focused on victory. They viewed home front difficulties as unfortunate but necessary sacrifices. Calls for peace were dismissed as defeatist. The government introduced laws to suppress dissent and control the press. Censorship intensified, critics were labeled traitors, and surveillance expanded. Even within the military, strain was visible. Letters from soldiers increasingly expressed concern for their families. The knowledge that their children went hungry while they fought in freezing trenches eroded morale. Desertions and psychological breakdowns became more common. As the war entered its fourth year, the German Empire endured enormous internal pressure. The social contract between ruler and ruled was unraveling. The monarchy, once a symbol of unity, appeared distant and indifferent. Kaiser Wilhelm the Second, already sidelined in military decision-making, retreated further from public life. Belief that the war was fought for honor, security, or justice gave way to the stark reality that it was endured simply to survive. The turnip winter marked a turning point in the relationship between the state and its people. It exposed the fragility of the imperial system under total war. It revealed how vulnerable even a powerful nation could become when cut off from the global economy. It sowed the seeds of political radicalism, class resentment, and civil unrest that would erupt forcefully in the war's final year. As spring arrived in 1917, the physical hardships of winter eased slightly, but the deeper wounds of hunger, grief, and political betrayal persisted. The home front was no longer passive. It had become an active front shaping the empire's fate. German military leadership, aware that time was running out, turned to a final gamble, a massive Western offensive enabled by Russia's defeat and the redeployment of Eastern Front troops. It was a last attempt to break the stalemate, win the war, and silence dissent at home. The fate of the empire would now be decided not in conferences or diplomatic missions, but in the trenches of France. By early 1918, Germany approached a critical threshold. After more than 3 years of total war, strain on the military and civilians was severe. Yet leaders saw a fleeting window of opportunity. Russia had exited the war following the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, freeing hundreds of thousands of German soldiers. The United States had declared war the previous year, but its forces were not yet fully mobilized in Europe. If a decisive blow could be struck in the West, Germany might still win, or at least secure favorable peace. This belief shaped the Spring Offensive. Known to Germans as the Kaiserschlacht and to historians as the Spring Offensive, it was a desperate gamble by the High Command. Generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff knew time was not on Germany's side. Morale was collapsing at home. Resources dwindled, and the Allies would grow stronger with American entry. The offensive had to succeed quickly or risk total failure. Germany's strategy relied on surprise, mobility, and concentrated force. The aim was to break Allied lines before they could react, divide British and French forces, and push toward Paris. Nearly 50 divisions and thousands of artillery pieces were concentrated along a narrow front in northern France. These troops, drawn from the quiet Eastern Front, included stormtrooper units trained in infiltration tactics. On March 21st, German artillery launched one of the war's largest bombardments. Over several hours, millions of shells rained on British positions along the Somme. Then the infantry attacked. Fast-moving shock troops bypassed strong points, infiltrated trenches, and disrupted rear areas. British lines were overwhelmed in many sectors. Initial German gains were astonishing. Within days, they advanced more than 30 miles, unprecedented since the war's early months. This first phase, Operation Michael, was followed by other attacks: Operation Georgette in Flanders, Operation Blucher York near the Aisne, and others. Each aimed to unbalance the Allies, exploit weaknesses, and create momentum. For a brief period, Germany seemed on the brink of breakthrough, but success was deceptive. Rapid advance stretched supply lines to the limit. Roads and railways could not keep pace. Rations, ammunition, and reinforcements arrived late, or not at all. Exhausted, underfed soldiers began looting abandoned Allied depots rather than pressing forward. The advance slowed. Gains came at staggering cost. German casualties during the Spring Offensive numbered in the hundreds of thousands, losses Germany could not afford. The army already faced manpower shortages. Fresh troops included very young recruits and older soldiers recalled into service. Replacements were increasingly scarce. The Allies, though shaken, regrouped quickly. French and British commanders coordinated more effectively. General Ferdinand Foch was appointed Allied Supreme Commander, unifying command and improving strategy. American troops, though few, provided psychological support and the promise of fresh strength. By summer, the German advance stalled. Allies counterattacked. At the Second Battle of the Marne in July, Franco-American forces repelled a major German offensive. In August, the 100 Days Offensive began, a series of sustained attacks that steadily pushed Germans from their positions. The German army, battered and demoralized, began a general retreat. At home, conditions worsened. Hopes raised by the Spring Offensive vanished. Germans faced ongoing shortages, deepening hunger, and a sense of betrayal. The naval blockade remained in full effect. Cities struggled with food distribution. The black market thrived as ration systems collapsed under demand and mismanagement. Industrial strikes spread again, and political agitation intensified. The working class, bearing war fatigue, turned toward radical politics. The independent Social Democratic Party, pacifist unions, and revolutionary groups gained influence. The government tried to maintain order but lost control over public sentiment. Within the military, morale further eroded. Desertions increased. Discipline became harder to enforce. Letters from the front revealed growing disillusionment. The once proud officer corps questioned whether the war could still be won, or if it should even continue. German leadership entered denial and paralysis. Kaiser Wilhelm II, never decisive, became isolated and out of touch. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, though commanding the army, faced political pressure to find a way out. By September, Ludendorff shocked colleagues, admitting the war was lost. In a closed meeting with civilian leaders, he urged an immediate armistice and suggested shifting blame to civilians and democratic politicians, a move with lasting post-war consequences. In October, Chancellor Georg von Hertling resigned. Prince Max of Baden became Chancellor, tasked with negotiating peace. For the first time, Germany moved toward constitutional reform. The military was nominally subordinated to the civilian government, and talks began based on peace proposals outlined by President Woodrow Wilson. But events outpaced government response. In the Navy, plans for a final suicidal assault on the British fleet sparked revolt among sailors at Kiel. Mutiny spread rapidly to other ports and cities. Workers' and soldiers' councils, echoing Russian Soviets, formed, calling for peace, democracy, and the end of monarchy. By early November, revolution was underway. Bavarian politicians declared the monarchy ended in Munich. Other regions followed. Crowds gathered in Berlin demanding the Kaiser's abdication. Army units refused to fire on demonstrators. The empire unraveled not under foreign occupation, but from within. On the 9th of November, faced with overwhelming pressure, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. That same day, the German Republic was proclaimed from a balcony of the Reichstag building by Social Democratic leader Philipp Scheidemann. The centuries-old German monarchy had come to an end. 2 days later, on the 11th of November, the armistice was signed in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne. At the 11th hour, the guns fell silent. The war was over. The collapse of the Kaiserreich was not the result of a single defeat, but of cumulative failures, military, political, economic, and moral. The spring offensive had been the empire's final gamble, its last chance to turn the tide. When it failed, the structure of the empire rapidly disintegrated. As autumn 1918 unfolded, the German Empire teetered on the brink of collapse. The failure of the spring offensive, relentless Allied counterattacks, and a deepening home front crisis had left the imperial government paralyzed. The once confident leadership of the Kaiserreich could no longer contain the swelling tide of unrest sweeping the nation. What began as military defeat was rapidly transforming into social and political revolution. In the final days of October, unrest reached the German Navy. At the naval base of Wilhelmshaven, sailors learned the high seas fleet was being ordered out to sea in what many believed would be a suicidal final confrontation against the British Royal Navy. With the war effectively lost, the idea of sacrificing lives in a symbolic gesture sparked outrage. Sailors refused to weigh anchor. Mutiny spread rapidly from ship to ship. By early November, the revolt extended beyond the Navy. In Kiel, sailors and workers seized control of the city. Soldiers and workers' councils were formed, modeled on the revolutionary Soviets of Russia. Their demands included peace, sweeping political change, democratic reforms, the removal of the monarchy, and social justice. The uprising spread like wildfire across Germany. Within days, major cities, Hamburg, Bremen, Munich, Cologne, were in open revolt. Military discipline crumbled. Local authorities either fled or tried to negotiate with revolutionaries. The imperial government, recognizing that control was slipping, acted quickly. On the 3rd of October, Prince Max of Baden was appointed Chancellor, replacing conservative Georg von Hertling. Prince Max represented a moderate voice acceptable to both traditional elites and reformist factions. His mission was to oversee the transition toward peace and political reform. In an unprecedented move, constitutional changes were enacted. The Chancellor would now be responsible to the Reichstag rather than the Kaiser, and the military would be subordinated to civilian authority. These measures aimed to appease unrest at home and convince the Allies Germany was moving toward democracy. But the reforms came too late. The revolutionaries demanded more than constitutional adjustments. They sought a complete break from the old order. Workers and soldiers, exhausted from years of war and sacrifice, saw no future in a system dominated by aristocrats, industrialists, and military officers. They demanded the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II and the establishment of a republic. Kaiser Wilhelm, meanwhile, was in Spa, Belgium, at the German military headquarters. Despite growing pressure, he refused to abdicate, still believing in the army's loyalty. Hindenburg and Ludendorff had advised him to step down earlier, but Wilhelm clung to hope he might retain at least the Prussian crown, if not the imperial title. Events on the ground rendered these hopes irrelevant. In Berlin, mass demonstrations escalated. Revolutionary crowds, joined by striking workers and returning soldiers, marched through the streets. On the 9th of November, facing the threat of violence and total chaos, Prince Max of Baden acted unilaterally. Without the Kaiser's consent, he announced Wilhelm's abdication and declared that the emperor had renounced both the imperial and Prussian thrones. This decision was symbolic, marking the end of the Hohenzollern dynasty's rule over Germany, a lineage spanning centuries. The German Empire, established in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles in 1871, had been brought down by defeat abroad and revolution at home. On the same day, Prince Max handed the chancellorship to Friedrich Ebert, leader of the majority Social Democrats. Ebert, a pragmatic politician committed to parliamentary democracy, sought to stabilize the country. But events were moving too fast for careful planning. That afternoon, Philipp Scheidemann, a fellow Social Democrat, took the initiative. Fearing radical revolutionaries might declare a Soviet-style republic, Scheidemann stepped onto a balcony of the Reichstag building and proclaimed the German Republic. His words to the crowd marked the public and official end of the monarchy. He had not consulted Ebert or party leadership, but the act was irreversible. Only hours later, in another part of Berlin, revolutionary socialist Karl Liebknecht, recently released from prison, declared the formation of a free socialist republic. Although less widely accepted and lacking legal authority, it revealed divisions among revolutionary forces and foreshadowed future political conflicts. Wilhelm II, now without throne or clear path, fled to the Netherlands, where he would live in exile until his death years later. The Kaiser, who once promised to lead Germany to greatness, departed quietly, his imperial ambitions reduced to memory. The new republic faced immediate and daunting challenges. The war was still technically ongoing. Armistice negotiations were underway, but no agreement had yet been reached. Germany's military remained deployed across vast swathes of France and Belgium. The Allies demanded not only cessation of hostilities, but also full withdrawal and disarmament. Friedrich Ebert, leading the provisional government, sought to avoid chaos. He feared further revolution, particularly from radical leftist groups like the Spartacists, could plunge the country into civil war. To maintain order, Ebert made a controversial pact with the German military, known as the Ebert-Groener Pact. It secured the army's support for the new government in exchange for promises to preserve military structure and suppress further revolutionary activity. This agreement set the stage for post-war politics in the Weimar Republic. On one hand, it allowed a relatively peaceful transition and ensured the republic survived its fragile beginnings. On the other, it tied the fate of the democratic government to the institutions that had upheld the imperial regime, a contradiction that would haunt the Republic for years. 2 days later, on the 11th of November, the armistice was signed in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne. Germany agreed to withdraw forces from occupied territories, surrender large quantities of military equipment, and accept severe restrictions. Although harsh, the terms were not yet the final peace that would come months later with the Treaty of Versailles. In the immediate aftermath, Germany's mood was complex and contradictory. Relief at the war's end mixed with confusion, anger, and profound loss. Some welcomed the fall of the monarchy and the birth of a republic. Others mourned what they saw as betrayal, a collapse engineered by revolutionaries, socialists, and civilians, rather than battlefield defeat. The narrative that Germany had been stabbed in the back by internal enemies was not yet fully formed, but began circulating among conservatives, former officers, and nationalists. It would soon become a powerful myth, shaping post-war politics and undermining the Weimar government's legitimacy. For now, Germany stood at a historic crossroads. The old imperial order was gone. A new republic, uncertain and fragile, had been born not through reform but through revolution. Its leaders inherited a nation exhausted by war, scarred by loss, and divided in vision. The challenge ahead was immense: to rebuild a shattered society, restore economic stability, and forge a democratic future from the ruins of empire. The German Empire had existed just under half a century. From its proclamation in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles in 1871 to its collapse amid revolution and armistice in November 1918. In that time, it reshaped Europe, altered global power balances, and left a legacy echoing far beyond its formal end. At its foundation, the empire was a bold experiment. The unification of German states under Prussian leadership through military success, diplomacy, and political calculation was not born from popular consent or liberal reform, but from war. The empire contained contradictions: federal in structure yet dominated by one state, industrially modern yet politically conservative, socially dynamic yet governed by a rigid elite. Otto von Bismarck's chancellorship defined its early years. His domestic policies combined repression and reform to secure unity and stability in a rapidly changing society. His foreign policy, careful and restrained, kept Germany central in Europe without provoking direct confrontation. Yet the system depended heavily on his personal control. Once removed, it proved brittle. Under Kaiser Wilhelm II, the empire became more assertive and unpredictable. Naval expansion, colonial ambitions, and political volatility reflected Germany's growing power, but also fueled anxiety among other great powers. Diplomatic isolation, a naval arms race with Britain, and tensions with France and Russia all contributed to European instability. Domestically, the empire struggled to adapt. Industrialization created new social classes, political movements, and demands for participation. The rise of the Social Democrats, growth of trade unions, and spread of popular culture revealed a society in motion. Yet the imperial system resisted meaningful reform. Power remained concentrated in the Kaiser, military, and conservative elites. When World War I began, Germany entered conflict with confidence, believing in its strength. But the war exposed the weaknesses of its foundations. Military strategy built on speed failed. The economy buckled under blockade and total mobilization. The social fabric frayed under hunger, loss, and disillusionment. In its final year, the empire collapsed from within. The 1918 revolution was not just the result of battlefield defeat, but of cumulative military, political, and moral failures. The Kaiser's abdication and the Republic's proclamation marked the end of one era and the uncertain beginning of another. Yet the German Empire's story did not end in 1918. Its legacy continued to shape the 20th century profoundly. The unresolved tensions of its final years, between militarism and democracy, nationalism and pluralism, elite control and popular participation, would re-emerge in new forms during the Weimar years and beyond. The myth that the empire had been betrayed from within, the so-called stab-in-the-back legend, undermined confidence in the democratic order, fueled resentment, encouraged conspiracy theories, and provided fertile ground for extremism. In this sense, the failure to fully reckon with the empire's collapse became one of its most enduring consequences. Yet not all aspects of its legacy were negative. Germany's scientific, technological, and cultural achievements remain remarkable. The foundations of the modern welfare state, pioneered under Bismarck, continue to influence social policy. Tensions between federalism and central authority, tradition and change, remain relevant today. Perhaps the most lasting lesson of the German Empire is that power without accountability and ambition without restraint carries inherent risk. Its pursuit of status, influence, and security led to overreach diplomatically, militarily, and politically. Its inability to adapt socially, reliance on hierarchical authority, and failure to broaden political participation undermined its endurance. Remembering the German Empire requires moving beyond nostalgia or condemnation. It was neither a golden age nor an aberration, but a complex chapter in modern Europe's story. Its rise and fall illuminate the possibilities and perils of nation-building in the industrial age. Its history challenges us to consider how societies manage change, distribute power, and respond to crisis. More than a century has passed since its end, yet questions about identity, governance, and power remain. Studying the German Empire is not merely looking backward, but reflecting on the paths we choose today.